Hello, hello, welcome back. We are moving on to part 3 of chapter 16. We are going to be exploring different locations in our endocrine system over here. So now that we have become little mini experts on the anterior and posterior pituitary gland and our hypothalamus, it is time to take a look at different locations like our thyroid, our pancreas, our gonads, and see which hormones are being produced and secreted there. I do want to make a quick note. I do want to point out that even though, as I mentioned in part 1, I write my own exams and the exams will be fully based on the lectures as well as the PowerPoints, I do highly recommend that you still peruse and read the entire textbook chapters. And part of that is that when you sit down and do your homework, you're going to notice that the questions in the homework are a mix of our discussions. They're like 80% of our discussions, and the other 20% might mention some items that I didn't specifically talk about, but that are listed in the book. Obviously, when you do your online homework through the mastering site, you will be able to use your book as you're kind of doing the questions, and you'll have 2 attempts to answer each question as you're working through the homework assignment. But it makes it a lot easier if you're kind of familiar with the chapter, so that you definitely don't run out of time, which no one should. So I highly recommend that you definitely peruse the chapter and then focus heavily on our lectures and the PowerPoints. And also, if I'm discussing something and you want to read more about it, definitely refer back to the book, or you could just email me, right? I'll be more than happy to give you more examples or a more detailed explanation of it. Alrighty, so let's start off part 3 and let's take a look at what's happening in our thyroid gland. All right, so the thyroid gland is located towards the anterior side of your trachea. I'm going to show you a picture of it once again, but you have been introduced to it before in part 2. It sits right below your little voice box, your little larynx, and what we see happening is that it's 2 lobes that are connected by a little isthmus. And a little isthmus just means that you have a little mass of tissue that's going to make a connection between the 2 lobes itself. From a histology point of view, we see that if we zoom into the thyroid, that is filled with these little follicles. And these follicles are going to be important because they're going to be surrounded by follicular cells, which are going to help us with our thyroid hormone production. And inside the follicle, it's going to be filled with this protein base called colloid. And the colloid will go ahead and interact with iodine, which will then form the precursor to the thyroid hormones that we are relying of the follicular cells. We also need to talk about cells called parafollicular cells. Para means outside, so it will sit outside the follicle. These are going to be producing another hormone called calcitonin. So for your thyroid hormone, we're going to take a look at 2 hormones. We're going to take a look at the thyroid hormone, and we're also going to be taking a look at the calcitonin. Let's take a look at a few illustrations so we can get better acquainted with your thyroid gland. So here we see our little larynx, that's our little thyroid cartilage. Fun fact, thyroid cartilage is very sensitive to testosterone. So because males tend to have higher levels of testosterone, the thyroid cartilage tends to be more pronounced, and that is now what we call the Adam's apple. Yeah, so right below it you can see our little thyroid. Here it is. And you can see our little mass that's connecting the 2 lobes. That's the little isthmus, okay? Here we see it from a histology point of view, and what we see is that the thyroid is filled of these follicles, and these follicles are just these circles that you're seeing right here. So here's one, here's another one, here's a 3rd one, a 4th one, a 5th one, and since I'm on a roll, 6 and 7. Okay, so lots of follicles all around. And what you can see here on the illustration is that all the cells that make up the membrane, or I should say the circumference of the follicle, are called follicular cells. And the follicular cells are going to give us our thyroid hormone. But then you also have batches of cells that sit outside the follicles that have nothing to do with the follicles. So like, here's another batch of them. Here's another batch of them. These cells that sit outside the follicle, they're going to be called parafollicular cells. And they're going to be secreting the secondary hormone that we're going to talk about in the thyroid, which is your calcitonin. Okay, so the follicular cells are going to be important because they're going to give us our thyroid hormone, and the parafollicular cells are going to give us our calcitonin. And then here's the colloid, the protein that's in the middle, and that of course is this bright pink area right here that helps with the pre-production of the thyroid hormone. All right, now anytime you think thyroid hormone, I think many of us will think about like metabolic actions, and that's completely true, which we're going to explore in the next slide. But I do want to point out that thyroid hormone does come in two forms. It comes in T4 and T3. The 4 and the 3 indicate how much iodine it has attached to it. So T4 has 4 iodine, that's the tyrosine. That's actually the version that your body prefers. And then T3 only has 3 of them. We're going to talk more about T4 and T3 when we do our digestive system, but I definitely just wanted to point out that it has 2 versions, and the cell definitely prefers T4 over T3, so that's just a little FYI. When it comes to the actual mechanism of the thyroid hormone, we know that it's essential for every single cell in the body, and part of that is going to have to do with the fact that it has what we call a calorigenic effect. So it's going to help us burn our calories that we're consuming, and that's because your thyroid hormone can go up and heighten our metabolic rate, and as a side product of doing our metabolic rate, it also increases our heat production. So it's very important for regulation of our body temperature. Your thyroid hormone can also play a role in regulating your tissue growth and development, and it even has another role in that it can interact with the adrenergic receptors in your blood vessels, which can go ahead and regulate vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So it controls the size of the lumen of your blood vessels, which means that it actually plays a role in blood pressure as well. But its primary role is going to be the metabolic rate and heat production, okay? And then also one thing that I want to point out is keep in mind that thyroid hormone is only secreted after your anterior pituitary gland will release thyroid stimulating hormone. And thyroid stimulating hormone is a tropic hormone because it travels over to the thyroid and it causes the thyroid hormone to be released. Now, here's a look at the other hormone that's being secreted by your thyroid. This is called calcitonin. Calcitonin is being secreted by our parafollicular cells. Remember the cells that lie outside the follicle. And calcitonin doesn't really have an effect in humans because we're mostly able to regulate our calcium levels. But what we see happening is that if there's an issue with your calcium in the fact that it's very high in the bloodstream, so you have abnormally high amounts of calcium floating around in your bloodstream, your body will produce calcitonin, and calcitonin will then go ahead and cause that high calcium level to be reduced. And the way it does that is it takes the calcium from the bloodstream and it basically encourages bones to uptake it, meaning that the calcium gets absorbed into the bone. And when it gets absorbed into the bone, it stimulates what we call osteoblast activity. B is for building. So your bones will take this extra calcium and it will actually start building bones, and it will help with the remodeling of the bones. So on your PowerPoint, I wrote down that if we go all the way down, I wrote down that if the calcium is higher than normal, we do see that it will inhibit osteoclast. Osteoclast is bone breaking. We don't want any more bone to be breaking down. On a normal day, your bone breaks down and builds back up. It's part of maintenance process. We don't want the bone to go through osteoclast because if it does that as the bone is being broken down, it releases the calcium from the bone and it puts it in the bloodstream. If you already have high levels of calcium in your blood, you don't want any more. So calcitonin will actually inhibit osteoclast but it will increase osteoblast activity, because osteoblast is bone building, meaning that it will increase the willingness of the bone to take the calcium from the blood and use it for its remodeling process. So the end result of calcitonin is that it lowers the blood calcium levels, which means that if you remember our discussion from part 1, when we talked about the humoral stimuli of endocrine glands and we introduced the parathyroid hormone, it works the opposite of the parathyroid hormone. And if you don't exactly remember, don't stress. We're actually going to encounter the PTH in just a little bit. But it works the opposite, because calcitonin responds to high calcium levels in the blood and it lowers it, where parathyroid hormone responds to low calcium levels in the blood and it causes an increase in calcium in the bloodstream. All right, so calcitonin being produced by the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland. So it responds to high calcium levels, and its mechanism of action is to lower the calcium by inhibiting osteoblasts, inhibiting osteoclast, increasing osteoblast, and thereby allowing the bones to take up more calcium so that the calcium in the bloodstream is reduced. All right, so let's take a look at what's happening behind the thyroid. We have our parathyroid glands over there, and these are just bundles of cells. It can vary from individual to individual. Most people have 4, but you can have anywhere from 4 to 8 that are just kind of embedded on the back of the thyroid. These little clusters of cells are full of parathyroid cells, also oxyphil cells. They look a little bit different. I'll show it to you in a picture. But either way, the main cells are the parathyroid cells, because they are going to be secreting parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone, unlike calcitonin, is extremely important to the body because it's one of the main ways that we actually regulate our calcium levels. Now remember, parathyroid hormone responds the opposite of calcitonin. So parathyroid hormone is going to respond to low blood calcium levels, and its main goal is, of course, to increase the levels that are flowing around in the plasma of our blood. And the main targets for parathyroid hormones are going to be the skeletal system, the kidneys, and the intestines, with a heavy focus on the skeletal system because our bones are full of calcium. So if we don't have enough calcium in the bloodstream, the easiest thing to do is to go over to our bones, get the bones to break down, release their calcium, and allow it to go into the bloodstream. The kidneys and intestines also have some storage of calcium. So here is a little illustration, and as you can see, we're looking at the back, the posterior view. Here's our little trachea. We have our little esophagus that goes over to the stomach. We see the lobes of the thyroid sticking out, and then here in yellow, they went ahead and they drew for you the clusters that are our parathyroid hormone. Take a look at the histology aspect of it, and what we see is that from a histology aspect, parathyroid hormone looks completely different than the thyroid hormone. Notice how there's no follicles. Instead, you just have clusters of cells, and what we see happening is that the majority of the cells are relatively small. Their cytoplasm has been stained as well. Those are the parathyroid cells. Those are the main focus ones because they're going to secrete the parathyroid hormones, but they also do have oxyphil cells. Oxyphil cells tend to be larger in size, and they tend to have more cytoplasmic content. But that's just a little FYI, because like I said to you, our main focus is going to be on the parathyroid cells. So let's kind of take another look at what their function is. We know it's going to be secreted when the calcium levels are low, but let's just add a little bit more detail to its mechanism of action. Okay, so right over here it says the parathyroid hormone will go ahead and stimulate osteoclast. Remember, it's doing the opposite of calcitonin, right? So it's going to stimulate osteoclast. Osteoclast means that you're going to start breaking down the bone, and as you break down the bone is going to start releasing calcium, and that calcium is going to go into the bloodstream, because our main goal, like I said to you before, is to increase calcium levels in the blood. It's also going to enhance reabsorption of calcium by the kidneys. Reabsorption means that the kidneys are going to return it into the bloodstream. It also activates vitamin D, and vitamin D seems to actually speed up absorption of calcium by the intestinal mucosa. By absorbing calcium by the intestinal mucosa, that means that you take any calcium that's found in the digestive tract that might be coming down from undigested or digested food, and basically allowing it to be absorbed, meaning that it leaves the digestive tract and it goes into the bloodstream. So whether you're getting it through osteoclast, whether you're getting it from the kidneys, or you're getting it from the digestive stream, we see that all three scenarios will lead to more calcium ions being deposited into the bloodstream. I do want to point out that right here it says it stimulates osteoclast, which means that it's going to inhibit osteoblast activity. Let me see if I can spell that. Oh, osteoblast. Okay, I can't draw, and I also can't write with this screen, okay? We'll work on it. All right, osteoblast, the B is for building. So it will prevent the bone from, in essence, thickening or remodeling, because it doesn't want to take any more calcium from the blood. So the parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoblast and inhibits I said that wrong, my apologies. The parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoclast and it inhibits osteoblast. Its main goal is to increase how much calcium you have in the blood. And please make a notation if you're making your little table that the calcitonin and parathyroid hormone are perfect examples of an antagonistic hormone, because they clearly work opposites from each other. Now, I do want to point out for those of us who are reading the book and following along that right now we should be looking at the adrenal gland. But what I did is I actually made the adrenal gland its own little section. So please skip ahead over to section 16.10 so we can take a look at the pineal gland. And then if we go over to the recording for part 4 for chapter 16, you'll see that the main focus will be on the adrenal gland. That one needs a little bit more attention because there are quite a few hormones that need to be discussed between the cortex and the medulla. All right, now the pineal gland. This one's actually a very interesting one. If you take a look at the picture of the brain on your right-hand side, you can see where the pineal gland is located. It sits very close over to the third ventricle. In fact, if you've ever dissected a brain, usually if you take the cerebrum and the cerebellum and you kind of fold them over, you can actually see the little pineal gland sticking out. The pineal gland is known for what we like to call our circadian rhythm. So it is going to help us regulate our day and nighttime cycles, and it does so by secreting serotonin and melatonin. And the way it's going to work is that serotonin is usually secreted at higher quantities during the daytime, because that is when we are the most active. So that's when we're going to school, that's when we're going to work, that's when we're taking care of our business and doing everything else. At nighttime is usually when we see that we have a calming effect, that we want to kind of shut down, we slow down and we want to get some rest. So what we see happening is that the serotonin is then went ahead and converted into melatonin. And melatonin is going to be our nighttime hormone. It's going to be our calming hormone. Now, let's talk about a few things. First off is that I don't really like to say night and day cycles. I just like to say active versus inactive cycles, because some of us work at night. So let's say you have a job where you have to work at night. Maybe you work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. and then after that you come home and you sleep for a few hours, right? So what we see happening is that for you, in your case, we see that the serotonin will be highest when you're working at night, because that's when you're the most alert, that's when you're the most active. And then during the daytime, when you're catching up on your sleep and you're inactive and you're just kind of recharging, we see that your melatonin will spike. So I don't always like to relate day and night to it, although for most of us it will inhibit. Now, what we also see is that the pineal gland actually also plays a very important role in sexual maturation and puberty. We have seen that in different animal groups, it will actually regulate the sexual reproduction cycle within animals. And if there's any issues with the pineal gland or any issues with its secretion, you usually see that it will affect the timing of sexual maturation and puberty. So it also plays a role in that. But in humans, it's mostly studied for its circadian rhythm, so it's melatonin and serotonin. And in fact, an interesting study has actually shown that in areas like that have extensive winter or northern climates, meaning that they don't have full access to sunny hours, meaning they have long days where it's mostly nighttime, what we see happening is that the population tends to have higher levels of melatonin, which can overall affect their mood. They call it seasonal affective disorder, abbreviated as SAD or SAD. And this is when a patient will come in and will have symptoms like depression, sleepiness, irritability, carbohydrate cravings, and it's usually associated with the fact that the body is being exposed to excessive nighttime hours and not enough daytime hours. So the body is flooded with melatonin and very short on serotonin. And in fact, some doctors started noticing that the symptoms that go along with seasonal affective disorders are very similar to PMS, premenstrual symptoms. So they went ahead and they wanted to apply the treatment for SAD, SAD, to PMS and see if that would help with the increase of serotonin. Now, what exactly is that treatment? Well, it's called phototherapy. They basically have a light that stimulates sunlight, and the patient is asked to sit in front of it. So I've inserted a little picture. As you can see, we have our male patient that is sitting in front of the light. And it applies to both males and females, obviously. But it turns out that excessive exposure to the phototherapy will actually trick the body into making more serotonin. And as the melatonin starts to reduce and the serotonin starts to increase, it actually tends to have a very positive effect on the overall mood and behavior of the patient. So phototherapy is prescribed both for SAD as well as for PMS patients. All right, now another gland to explore is the pancreas. The pancreas sits a little bit behind the stomach. I went ahead and inserted the picture so you can kind of localize where it is. It is a very glandular type of tissue. I had mentioned the pancreas in part 1 because we talked about the fact that it's an example of a mixed gland. It's mixed because it produces lots of digestive enzymes. The cells that produce the digestive enzymes are called acinar cells. They are the main cells of the pancreas. And then you have clusters of cells inside of the little islet, also called the islet of Langerhans. And these cells that are clustered together, they are going to have the endocrine function because the majority of the cells are going to be alpha cells and beta cells. And they are going to give us the glucagon hormone as well as the insulin hormone. Okay, so that's going to be the endocrine section, and then the acinar cell will be the exocrine section because of the digestive enzymes. Let's go ahead and take a look at the pancreas from a histology point of view so we can see the difference in the cell types. Okay, so here is a typical little pancreatic islet. As you can see, it is a little cluster of cells that is isolated from the rest. Now, all the cells that are on the outside right here, these are acinar cells. And that's, like I said, that's the majority of the cells that you have in the pancreas. And the acinar cells are going to do our exocrine secretion of producing our digestive enzymes. So all these cells right here that are on the outside. On the inside of the cluster, of the inside of the islet of Langerhans, or the pancreatic islet, we see that we have alpha cells and we have beta cells. They're the ones that stain a little bit lighter. The alpha cells are going to be the ones that produce glucagon, and the beta cells are going to be the ones that produce insulin. You also, and this is just a little disclaimer, you also have delta cells. Delta cells are the ones that produce somatostatin. Somatostatin was the paracrine secretion that I was telling you about in part 1, that when it's released, its target cells are actually the alpha and the beta cells of the islets. We're not going to really discuss the delta cell since it's a paracrine secretion. We're going to focus more on the alpha and the beta. Oh, I also wanted to point out, someone had emailed me this question. There will be no pictures on the exam, and there will also not be any graphs or charts. All the exam questions will be straight up, just multiple choice or true and false questions. So someone had asked that, so I definitely wanted to answer that. All your pictures and chart-based and video-based questions will be handled through the homework assessments. All right, so sorry for that quick introduction, but I definitely wanted to make that little announcement. Let's take a look at glucagon and insulin, and it turns out that they are another example of an antagonistic pairing, so they're going to work the opposite of each other. All right, so let's start with glucagon. Now, glucagon is what we like to call a hyperglycemic agent, and hyper means to increase. So that means that glucagon, when it's released, will cause your glucose levels to increase, okay? So what we see happening here is that it's triggered by a decrease in blood glucose levels, rising amino acid levels, or the sympathetic nervous system, and its main goal is to raise your blood glucose. And usually what we see happening is that glucagon gets secreted in between meals. So in between breakfast and lunch, lunch and dinner, dinner and breakfast, whenever your body runs out of free-floating glucose, we see that it craves more glucose. So your body will go ahead and cause the release of glucagon, and glucagon will cause that increase in glucose to happen. Now, how exactly is it going to do that? Well, it has two main options. It can do glycolysis, or gluconeogenesis. Glycolysis means it's going to go after glycogen. Remember, glycogen, I told you before, is a temporary storage unit of glucose, and it's literally going to lyse or pull them apart so that the free-floating glucose molecules can enter the bloodstream. Okay, so glycolysis, everything's in the name, means I go after my glycogen and I lyse it, meaning I pull it apart, and now I have my glucose available for the bloodstream. The other option is to go over to a non-carbohydrate source. So you can go over to like an amino acid or a fat-based source, and you can basically synthesize glucose from those sources. When you do that, so when you use a non-carbohydrate source, use an amino acid or a fat-based source to make glucose, we call it gluconeogenesis. And gluconeogenesis, glucono, hence towards the glucose, genesis means to create. So you're going to create glucose from these alternative non-carbohydrate sources. Either way, whether you are pulling apart the glycogen or you're creating the glucose from the non-carbohydrate source, your end result is that glucose will enter into the bloodstream and your glucose level goes up. So therefore, glucagon, is a hyperglycemic agent. Insulin, on the other hand, is a hypoglycemic agent, meaning it's going to lower your blood glucose levels. Usually insulin is secreted or induced after meals. When you have a meal, especially if it has lots of carbs in it, so you're eating things like rice, like bread, like potato, there's so many based carbohydrate food sources. Anytime you have a carbohydrate, we see that your body will start breaking it down into glucose, and then the minute the blood glucose starts to increase, we see that your body will secrete insulin. Why? Well, because it turns out that the majority of your body, the cells in the body, cannot access the glucose by itself, so it needs insulin to literally open up the portal system so that glucose can be absorbed. Not all parts of your body require insulin for glucose absorption. Your red blood cells, for instance, your brain, your kidneys, they are able to absorb glucose by themselves. But the majority of the other organs require insulin for this absorption to occur. Now, the main reason why you need to absorb glucose is because if you remember from your biology course, you do cellular respiration, which means that you convert the energy from glucose with the use of the mitochondria into ATP molecules, which of course is our chemical energy unit that we utilize for all of our activities. So glucose is very important. And insulin serves to kind of take the glucose out of the bloodstream and put it into the individual cells, thereby lowering your overall blood glucose levels. So it is a hyperglycemic agent. As you can see at the bottom of the slide, it talks about the fact that we can do this 3 ways. It enhances the membrane transport of glucose into fat and muscle cells. It inhibits the breakdown of glycogen to glucose. We already have enough glucose, so why would we break more glycogen down? And it also will inhibit the conversion of the amino acids or fats to glucose. So that basically means that it's going to inhibit gluconeogenesis and inhibit glycolysis. So we don't want to break any additional sources down into glucose because we already have plenty of glucose molecules flowing around in the bloodstream, most likely due to the fact that we recently had a meal. So insulin is a hypoglycemic agent. For our last section in this particular part, let's take a look at the gonads. The gonads are going to be our reproductive organs, so we're going to emphasize the testes and the ovaries. I do want to point out that in a little bit when we go over to part number 4, we're going to take a look at the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland, as part of its many hormones that it does, will actually also secrete estrogen and testosterone. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's so important to both of the male and the female sex. So this little mention of gonads producing the same steroid sex hormones as the adrenal cortex. It's a little preview of part 4 that's on its way for our discussion. But either way, what we see happening is if we start focusing on the ovaries, the main hormone over there will be estrogen and progesterone. And what we see happening is that these female reproductive hormones are essential for obviously maturation of the reproductive organs, the appearance of the secondary sexual characteristics, so like the formation of the breast, formation of the additional adipose tissue in the hips, and that progesterone will cause breast development and the cyclic change in the uterine mucosa, so the thickening of the uterine lining, which is associated with getting ready for pregnancy or being shed off during the menstrual cycle. Please keep in mind that your estrogen and your progesterone, as well as in a little bit when we talk about the testes, the high levels of testosterone in males, those are all dependent on the release of the luteinizing hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. And remember the production of successful gametes, so the oocytes for the female and the sperm for the male, those are also dependent on the follicle stimulating hormone. Both FSH and LH are examples of gonadotropic hormones, meaning that they will cause the release of all the hormones that you see listed right here within the gonads. In the testes for the male, our main hormone there is going to be testosterone. And as you can see, its mechanism of action is going to be very similar to the females. It's going to initiate maturation of the male reproductive organs. It's going to cause the secondary sexual characteristics, and it also plays a role in your sex drive. It's necessary for normal sperm production and maintenance of the reproductive organs in a functioning state. I do want to point out that both male and females produce estrogen and testosterone, but what we're going to end up talking about is that females will rely on that testosterone production from the adrenal gland, and males will rely on the estrogen production also from the adrenal glands. So that is where they'll get access to the other sex hormones. Both of these hormones are essential for a successful reproductive system. It's just the ratio that will vary from one sex to the next. It's also important to point out that as we look towards the bottom of our slide, it mentions the placenta, and that's because when a woman is pregnant, the placenta provides an excellent source of heightened levels of estrogen and progesterone production, and it will also produce what we call the pregnancy hormone, which is the human chorionic gonadotrophic hormone, HCG. That hormone is only produced when a woman is pregnant, and that is then the hormone that's being picked up during a pregnancy test. Oftentimes I'm asked when they do ovulation tests, what are they looking for? Oftentimes they're looking for an increase in FSH and LH. So they're taking a look at the hormones that need to spike initially before the oocyte is fully matured and released for ovulation. All right, but during a pregnancy test, we basically test for HCG, which is the hormone that's only produced by the little fertilized egg or little zygote. All right, having said that, we have successfully made our way through part 3, which means there's only one more part of chapter 16. As you can see, this is a little bit of a lengthy chapter, has lots of different hormones, so hopefully we're following along and we're taking our notes. And like I said to you before, it really helps to have a little table made so you can kind of put all your hormones together, and it helps with the organization to kind of keep track of everything as well. In part 4 of our lecture, we are going to take a complete look at the adrenal gland, and we'll take a look at the hormones being produced by the cortex and the hormones being produced by the medulla. So I shall talk to you soon.